The other quality I wanted to ask about before we move on, that you mentioned in this anecdote about the Turkish children in the book, is trade complementarity, and how, maybe just as an example of how something that factors into our proclivity toward friendship.
Yeah, so the story in the book was that when I was a little boy, my mother was a Byzantine Greek. She had grown up in Istanbul, ethnically Greek, growing up in Istanbul. And my mother, there's a long and interesting family history there with intersects with the history of the 20th century. In the 1950s, there were sort of anti-Greek pogroms in Turkey. My mother's family basically fled the country, but many years later, as an American citizen, and my mother took us back. I was a little boy. I went back to Greece. My mother spoke Turkish, and I learned a little bit of Turkish when I was a boy. And we spent a summer in the kind of ancestral place where my mother had spent the summers when she was a little girl, on this little island on the Bosphorus in Turkey called Biyukada. That's how the Turks call it. The Greeks called it Prinkipolis. And we arrived there and we went out to play. I mean, I don't know how old I was. I must have been 8 or something, and my brother was 6 or something. And we went out to play, and we found some Turkish boys to play with. And it was very easy. The games were the same. And we sorted ourselves into groups and engaged in some kind of play warfare where we were throwing pine cones at each other, accumulating stocks of pine cones and lobbing them at the enemy, and maneuvering for advantage. And it was joyful and fantastic play. This is more than 50 years later, and I remember it fondly. I remember the experience of playing in these pine forests behind the house. And the reason I tell the story in the book is that there is a long tradition in anthropology and in psychology to study, a huge and fascinating literature to study the origins and functions of play and the way in which certain kinds of play don't vary from place to place and culture to culture. And one of the arguments about play is that it prepares us to live socially, and that if you think about a lot of children's play, it's about getting along with others. It's about creating little social situations and so on. And so here we were, cross cultures. We had different haircuts and different attire and spoke different languages, me and my brother and these Turkish boys. And yet we had a wonderful time. And the rules of play and the social rules of play were very obvious to all of us. And we were able to engage in this activity quite happily and quite productively. And this activity was characterized by a number of features, one of which, as you mentioned, was this trade complementarity. We very naturally developed a little economy where we were trading, small pine cones that were like this big with big ones where the petals had all erupted open. And, we were doing all kinds of things that were features of society and of economies.